One of the things that you and I have had the opportunity to talk about, that I hope we had the opportunity to talk about today, is that there tends to be two schools of thought in chiropractic. And one of those schools of thought tends to say that there is no value in the chiropractic philosophy, that it is something of a historical aspect that correlates to chiropractic, but it has no bearing on how we do chiropractic today and how we do chiropractic moving forward. And that's one perspective that sits at one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum would be a highly dogmatic, bordering on religious perspective of the chiropractic philosophy, that it went from God to DD to the Green Books, or God to BJ to the Green Books. And of course, I'm being a little facetious there, but that makes the point that there is a spectrum of interpretation and a spectrum of what is the value of this philosophy and how is it going to inform our action. What we want to provide is both a grounding in what does the philosophy say, how does the philosophy guide us and answer these questions that we've just put forth, as well as a rejuvenation of the philosophy, a reiteration, a remembering of the philosophy. Zach, you shared with me earlier that remember means to put back together, and that there is this idea that principles, that truth exists outside of their articulation of these truths. And anytime a truth is articulated, it is inevitably a partial representation of that deeper truth, because words are inadequate to describe something that is beyond words. And much of what we are getting at with chiropractic is in the realm of metaphysical, beyond the physical realm. And words are part of the physical realm. And thus they will never fully articulate an idea. And so that's the dance that I see happening in this podcast, is that we're going to be looking at how these principles were articulated in the past. And we are so grateful for all the green books and the other chiropractic philosophy that is out there. And at the same time, so we are remembering, in that sense, what has been said. And we are remembering, we are re-putting together, we are re-examining and re-articulating those philosophies and those principles based on our own experiences and our own present day perspective, and in seeing what value 2021 may have on principles that came from 1900.
It's a beautiful time to be alive. There are an increase in quantity and quality of conversation that have to do with big truths. Big truths that are self-evident, big truths that are observable, big truths that are experiential, that often are so commonplace that they go unnoticed and uncontemplated. Like, if I cut my arm, it starts to regrow. If I cut a rock, it doesn't start to regrow. There is something guiding the organization of matter and the direction of energy in my body to regrow. To name that, in chiropractic, we call that an innate intelligence. And that is what is driving the direction of the energy and the organization of the matter to heal. And in chiropractic, we look to see if there are interferences in the ability for that innate intelligence to express through the body, which it does predominantly and exclusively through the nervous system. And so philosophy is stating the obvious principles, and it's naming them and in recognizing that they are foundational. And so we don't get lost in the details. Now, inductive reasoning is all about the details of the parts. You take all the parts that you can find and get all the details about it, and you try to explain the bigness of something. Deductive reasoning is the bigness is inherently obvious. it's obvious that there is something driving the organization of matter and the direction of energy in living things towards growth, healing, reproduction, survival, and we call that innate intelligence. And that demystifies it. It's not this religious thing that you need to believe. It's naming the obvious. And I think it's important for people to realize how simple that is and how it's not disconnected from the naming and measuring and describing of the parts, which is inductive, which is predominantly what's done in institutionalized sciences. And they work hand in hand, and they're very important. In chiropractic, consistent clinical findings, for example, are what actually manifests in the real world. And from the results of the actual manifestations, we can measure things and get better ideas of how that did that and why that did that. You see how the measuring of the parts can work hand in hand with an understanding of the general understanding is plants grow towards sun. Cut a human arm, it starts to regrow. And it's got this programming of health. And when it's not interfered with, it's better at doing its programming of towards health, towards optimization, towards thriving. Yeah, like you said, on one end, you can get really religious with philosophy and make it very mystical and deify the people who first put the things down into words and then take every word that they say as gospel. And on the other hand, you can take scientism, rigid dogmatic scientism as a religion, and say, if we haven't been able to measure it, it doesn't exist. And it's silly to think it does. Both of those are limiting belief systems. And the balance is to find out how they complement each other, how they work together, and when to lead with which one and when to lead with the other one. And when you've got systems that just has more parts than you can measure, like the human body, it's best to lead with the principles that are obvious. And I think that's a good kind of big picture zoom in on what principles are, their value, and how they fit in with science.
Absolutely. And there's this idea in philosophy, and this is something that I appreciate about you, Zach, is there's philosophy outside of chiropractic philosophy, right? The big umbrella is philosophy. The sub-umbrella is chiropractic philosophy. And in the big umbrella of philosophy, there's this word called a priori. It means before. And you make a priori assumptions, or there are a priori principles upon which further thought is based on, that you need a foundation upon which you say, now we are going to start to explore, but this is the ground we walk on. And where I hope to see a bridging of the deductive and the inductive, a bridging of the metaphysical and the physical, is in that understanding of relationship and scope of question. So science is a phenomenal tool of inquiry, right? It is a process of inquiry. That's what the scientific method is. It gives you structure upon which you can ask questions and receive answers. And this is very valuable. Science is predicated a priori on asking questions in the physical realm. They are seeking to observe and to measure experiences that are physical. And science has incredible inductive reasoning capacity within that container that it shaped for itself, which the box that science lives in is the physical. Now, there is a realm outside of physical called metaphysical, above physical, outside of physical. And the metaphysical realm is one that science is inadequate to inquire into. Not because science is inadequate, but because science, in its structure, in the container that makes science science, is limited in where it can inquire, and it has to stay within the physical to inquire. And for many people in modern society, that's where the line ends, is where can science ask questions? And then there is an a priori assumption built into societal thinking that says if the question can't be measured by science, it's not a question worth asking. It's not even a valid question, and it's certainly not a question that has an answer. For thousands and thousands of generations, our ancestors have known through deductive reasoning, through the noticing and the observing of effects, they deduced there was a cause for that effect. And that cause, as Zach has been saying for us, intelligence, that intelligence precedes organization. If you found a book in the forest and it was a beautiful narrative, you wouldn't say, wow, that must have just been a happenstance, that this book just came into being. No, you would say, this book has organization. It has a cover and binding, and there's sentence structure, and then there's paragraph structure, and then there's larger ideas that are structured across whole chapters, and then the whole book has an arc to it that gives you this understanding. There is obviously the expression of intelligence in that physical object called a book. And so too we can make this deductive, a priori assumption that there must be intelligence behind the organization and expression of form and matter. And what I find so valuable about chiropractic is that it gives us a vehicle to inquire into the metaphysical as well as the physical. And that's why chiropractic is a science and philosophy, because the science allows us to explore the physical, and the philosophy gives us the grounding to understand what's happening, and it's the grounding upon which the physical questions can then be asked. Zach, anything you want to say about that? Does that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's the simplest way to describe the obvious that is occurring. Putting words on what is consistently always happening. Life forms always are working while they're alive to stay alive, and there are systems in there. They're made to be fragile and to break down and to only be here for a period of time. That's part of it. That's also obvious. It is a principle, not a chiropractic principle, but it is a truth upon which other truths are built, that living things die. The vessels die. And while they're alive, it's also a principle that's just observable consistently, immutably, eternally. Living things seek to stay alive. They also seek to evolve. You could say, so a good theory has limited numbers of assumptions and explains maximum numbers of things. And so you could say that consciousness exists, which is pretty self-evident, and you could say that it seeks to evolve, which is pretty self-evident. And it doesn't really matter as much the words that you use or the angle that you engage it. What's important is that people see that there are consistently obvious things that are happening, and they give labels to them. And those are the obvious truths that are foundational, upon which so much else is built. I mean, think about how many things are built off of the concept that we have living bodies that are programmed to heal themselves. There's so much in our life, rich, detailed things that are predicated off of that.